Welcome to the Pritzker Military Museum and Library's virtual learning studio in Chicago, Illinois. I am Kathleen McDonald, Senior Director of Strategy, Programs, and Education. Founded in 2003, the Pritzker Military Museum and Library's mission is to increase the public's understanding of military history, military affairs, and national security by providing a forum for the study and exploration of our military, past, present, and future, with a specific focus on their stories, sacrifices, and values. With national and global reach, the PMML aims to share the stories of those who have served to help citizens everywhere appreciate the relationship between the armed forces and the civilians whose freedoms they protect. The virtual learning studio offers monthly webinars designed for teachers to use in grades 6 through 12, but all ages can learn from our guest speakers from across the country. Be sure to sign up for our emails and go to our website for information on upcoming programs. Today's guest is U.S. Navy Commander Everett Alvarez, Jr., retired. Shot down at August 5th, 1964, U.S. Navy pilot Everett Alvarez, Jr. was held captive for 8 years and 6 months during the Vietnam War, becoming the second longest held prisoner of war in U.S. history. Not only surviving 3,113 days in captivity, but upon release resumed his military career, became a distinguished attorney, author, and entrepreneur, and is currently nominated for the Congressional Gold Medal. Commander Alvarez currently has a Silver Star, 2 Legions of Merit, a Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 Bronze Stars, and 2 Purple Hearts. So on behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, it gives me great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Commander Everett Alvarez, Jr. So
Thank
welcome.
you, Kathleen. Nice to be with you.
So to begin, can you tell us why you joined the Navy in 1960 and how long did you plan to serve?
Well, growing up, I always had a desire to fly. And when I was going to college at the University of Santa Clara in California, now in Silicon Valley, at that time, the Moffett Field was a base, a jet base right near, and we were basically under the pattern. And I always used to look up and watch the jets coming in. So when I had the opportunity before graduation, I took the examination for flight training with the Navy, and I passed. And so I had the opportunity to join and basically fulfill a lifelong dream, even though I was a double E student. And at the time, we had very promising futures, electrical engineers. I still wanted to see if I could, fulfill my ambitions with the Navy.
Now, was it common for Mexican Americans to serve in the military or to be pilots?
Mexican Americans have had a tradition of service to the country, and in those days, I recall that every family that I knew of that ethnic background used to proudly display their photographs of their sons or relatives in uniform. But I was a second generation American. I cannot talk to the question regarding immigrant families. And in those days, we had a lot of farm workers that were migratory in a sense. So I was in a different situation, and it was very common. I was planning on joining the Navy if I had not gone to college. And in those days, even though that we had the draft, it was something that we just understood we were going to serve in one capacity or the other. So it was common for Mexican Americans or Hispanics to join the military. With regard to pilot training, I did not run across many in my early career, but maybe 2 or 3 in the flight training program. And there was one I met later on. So that was not common in those days.
So in 1964, 4 years after joining, you're headed to the South China Sea on as an A4 pilot on the aircraft carrier USS Constellation. Did you expect that the U.S. would go to war?
At that time, this was during the Cold War, we had aircraft carriers stationed at various points in the far Western Pacific. And it was very routine to spend 6 or 7 months out there, naturally with port visits, but to be out there for 6-7 month cruises and then rotate back to the States. So as far as expecting things to go to war, no, not really. Things were starting to brew in South Vietnam at the time. And however, we were primarily focused on China and Russia back in those days. And like I said, the Cold War. But things started to develop. And when we left the States in May of '64, 3 months before I was shot down, we went to the location off of Vietnam, later became known as Yankee Station. And we were involved in doing some flying over the Laotian parts of Laos that if you recall, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where the North Vietnam were supplying the Viet Cong or rebels in the south of Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia. And so, yeah, we were involved a little bit, but there was not a lot of action. It was not until the day I was shot down that that was during our first strike. It was part of what we call the Tonkin Gulf incident. And that was when our 2 destroyers who were operating off the coast of North Vietnam were allegedly attacked by North torpedo boats. We have photo evidence, and it was a fact that they did attack our ship on August 2nd, but the controversy became of what actually happened on the night of August the 4th. And it was at that time that I was involved in air action over the two destroyers, in which those of us that were flying over the destroyers really didn't see anything. It was too dark. It was very stormy and rainy. But the next day, I was involved in the strikes against North Vietnamese torpedo boat bases. And that was when I was shot down. So all of this developed very rapidly within days. And that was an action that was taken, but that was the only action until we actually started bombing targets in the north of Vietnam 6 months later. So I was alone for first 6 months, and then gradually others were shot down, captured. And I didn't get a cellmate until 13 months and 8 days later after I was shot down.
So let's pause there if we can, because your first combat mission out on August 5th, 1964 was when you were shot down. And just to give our viewers a little bit more context, then from 1964 until January 27th of 1973, when the US and Vietnam signed a ceasefire agreement, which enabled your release on February 12th, 1973, after 3,113 days in captivity. So by March of 1973, the war is officially over. The US troops are withdrawing, except for military advisors and Marines protecting US installations, and they leave in that dramatic air evacuation in April 29th, 1975. So in previous interviews, you've described sort of 3 stages of your 8+ year imprisonment. So can you talk about those? And we've got a few slides that we can show while you do that.
Well, I would, you're correct. And it was basically 3 sessions. The first session, the first part was when I was by myself and in solitary confinement for the first 13 months, and until I had my first cellmate. For the first 6 months, I was interrogated, but really, since there was no war, I was not treated as a military prisoner of war, but as a criminal. So I was put into a prison that they use for their criminals, their murderers and thieves and what have you. But after the war, the bombing started 6 months after I was shot down, and others were being shot down and captured. The Vietnamese captors wanted me to cooperate and to help them understand our aviation and our training and what have you. And I refused to do that. So it was at that time that I was put into a 7-foot by 7-foot cell. And I was in that kind of an environment, very, very uncivilized when it comes to the treatment of other people, criminals, what have you. But I was in that condition. And then from the time I had my first cellmate in late 1965 until after Ho Chi Minh died in 1969, that was a very rough period. And we were pressured, we were even tortured for propaganda statements. We no longer had any value of military information, so they used us to extract propaganda statements, either radio tapes, to write letters of protest to the war, to make tapes to be and broadcast, make broadcasts to the troops in the South, things for just basically propaganda. I believe a lot of it was going to be used on their own population. And then after 69, when Ho Chi Minh died, by that time, the Paris peace talks had started, and there was a movement in the states where the families of the prisoners of war, the League of Families, organized and started to put pressure on not only our government, but also the Vietnamese government. They traveled to Paris, and they had a lot of public attention that was worldwide, actually. So a combination of all these factors, it was that at that time that our treatment gradually improved, the food, the outdoor activities, all of this gradually improved. Mail from home, they stopped the torture and other things for propaganda. Their methods of, they stopped using these barbaric methods. And then, and that really improved until 1973. When we were released, we were getting lots of food and what have you. Personally, I was, a low point was about 110 pounds.
Wow.
I was 142 pounds when I was released. My normal weight was 170 pounds. If you're interested, if anybody's interested in a better description of the conditions, I could refer you to, I think, is a very good book done by my one of my friends, it was Commander or Captain Mike McGrath, who did a book called Prisoner of War. If you can see this, it's a book of sketches he did. And he did a great job of depicting the type of treatment that we had when we were being forced to do propaganda, the conditions upon which we lived, and so forth. So it was called Prisoner of War, 6 Years in Hanoi, by, at that time, Lieutenant Commander McGrath, Mike McGrath.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you did in your cell to pass the time and how you communicated with fellow prisoners?
One of the primary method of communication between our cells was a tap code that we used to tap on the wall. And it was similar to a Morse code, but a series of taps. It was a 5 by 5 square, and we broke the alphabet up into 25 letters. So the only letter we did not use was K or kilo. We used the letter C for that one. But if you wanted to tap and say, let's say we wanted to say hi, okay, the letter H would be second row, third column. So it would be, or hi, I, second row, fourth column, and so forth. And so you could tap back and forth the letters and make up the words. And you had to do this very covertly, very, very silently, because if you were heard communicating outside of your cell, the camp commander had all of these restrictions, and communicating was probably the biggest one that we violated. And if they were found out, we would be severely punished by using all different kinds of punishment methods. And so we had to be very careful, but it was something that they could not stop us from doing, because it was the most important part of our existence, was our communication between all of us in the cells.
After your initial capture, there were interrogations for military information that you were talking about previously, but could you tell us more about the propaganda campaigns? And can you explain what the propaganda campaigns were used for? We have some photos that are of you while you're under captivity, and those were done for these propaganda campaigns.
Yeah, the first two that you saw there I was in my uniform, they had that was taken months after I was shot down, and they brought the uniform back and my helmet back, and I was paraded in an area, and then I was shown in front of a Vietnamese officer there. That was for propaganda, to show how well I was being treated, really. And so other efforts, the one I'm looking at here is how they wanted to show the public my flight suit and my helmet and others that they had shot down and captured. And what they used to do were have wear these pajamas, basically striped pajamas like that one, and then they would stencil a number in the back, which would be very high, and I think mine was like 600 or something, like in the 600s. It really doesn't make sense, because I was the first one shot down, but I think in this manner they would show that the public that they had shot down captured many pilots, which they did not have. But this was all part of their efforts. They wanted to use these methods, as you see here, to have us write and broadcast to the troops in the South, to the American public about the war, and that the American people, the public, was mostly in favor of, against the war, and in favor of stopping the war in some manner. And they used it for, as I said earlier, I think, to show other parts of the world, and particularly their own population, into how well we were being treated and how well they were doing in the progress of the war.
And did you see images while you were imprisoned of the anti-war protests in the United States?
Oh, yes. We had, they made sure that they showed us mostly home type movies of the anti-war protests in the various cities throughout the years, particularly from 1969 on, and of the number of Americans that were against the war. And it was a very divisive war, very controversial. And I think that a lot of that divisiveness and in opinion, in hindsight, it's still there amongst the population, amongst the Americans. And those that were anti-war, feel that they were correct. They feel that their activities were created great pressure on our government to stop, and get us out of the war. Others feel that it just encouraged the Vietnamese in their efforts and to keep at it, and that the United States would eventually give up. So I think that both sides feel that they were right. In hindsight, I know that the people I know, my family members, feel they did the right thing. It's all, and I'm not saying that they weren't right. I'm not saying that those who are on supportive of the war effort was correct. I just remember that this was during the Cold War, and our involvement in Vietnam, our involvement, it was a result of our position on the world stage, primarily in Europe, against Russian and communist expansion that was resisted by primarily the western part. We called it the Iron Curtain, and on the Asian side, it was the Bamboo Curtain. We were trying to stop the spread of communism. So the Vietnam War became a very divisive and in dispute at that time.
So can you tell us a little bit more about how you were able to maintain your values and the military's code of conduct under torture and starvation, and as you've spoken about, return with honor?
Well, yeah, we recognized that it was going to be very difficult and to survive in the conditions which we were in, and the only way to survive, you might say, was we would have to stick together and support each other. and maintain a military organization, because we were still Americans and still prisoners of war in our own minds. And so that's why I said earlier that communication was extremely important. And by sticking together and using our communication methods, tap code and others, we supported each other, we helped each other, and we enabled each other to exist and to continue to actually, our goals were to come home at someday. We didn't know when, but to do so in a manner in which our reputation would be upheld and our honor, our personal honor, would be upheld. And in doing so, we maintained our faith in our government, in the American people, our families, and our faith in our God. And all of these were extremely important because only through sticking to these values and these principles could we feel we could come out of there. And sticking to our principles and our values, we had to resist all of these methods of being used by the Vietnamese for their propaganda, and they went to extreme measures to get us to do this. In the end, I think that we held out, and I think that most of us felt pretty good about our obtaining our objective because we basically did the best we could. It was a tough go, but we couldn't have done it alone. We had to do it as a group. And I think that in hindsight, I think we all did a pretty good job.
Great. So when it came time to be released after the peace agreement happened, it still was some time before you were told about that and that you would be released as a POW. Can you tell us a little bit about what that experience was, how that timed out, and what your plans were, what you were thinking for your homecoming?
Well, building up to being released, we, by that time, having been there so long, most of us felt that the only way we were going to get out of there was if we stepped up the bombing and forced the North Vietnamese to come to terms. And so eventually that happened after the election in 1972. The campaign of bombing the targets, the logistic targets, and ports and other military targets around the capital, Hanoi. I was one that was in the Hanoi Hilton there at that particular time. I spent a lot of time in the Hanoi Hilton, but I remember the bombing just day and night, and it drove the Vietnamese government to terms that we eventually obtained at the Paris peace talks, so that we knew that when the bombing stopped, it would be for good. And sure enough, the more we bombed, the more food they gave us, the better treatment. And when it stopped, they opened up with a lot of packages and mail from home. They gave us a lot of more food and it was pretty evident that we were going to be going home. And I recall about 2 weeks before we actually were released, they called all of us out into the courtyard and they read the peace agreements and told us we would be going home. The day finally came, the night before the February the 11th of 73, they issued us clothing, actual shoes, and actual a jacket, clothing. We could take a few items with us in a little a duffel bag we had. And the next morning, bright and early, the first 40 guys that were shot down and captured, by that time, we were in the same cell, a big cell. And they took us and marched us out. And it was the first time that we had actually been moved from one location to another without being blindfolded and handcuffed. And so it was a big day. It was an exciting day, but like I said, there was a lot of, it was a day that for me and others, it was a long time coming. Myself being there 8.5 years, others 8 years or 7 months. The first guys that you see here lined up, we'd been there a long time, and it was a momentous occasion.
So from the planes, you went to hospital and had some recuperation before you came back to the States. Is that correct?
We were flown from Hanoi there to Clark Air Force Base in the military in the Philippines. There was a military hospital there. We were there for about a couple of days, and then they started to send us home to hospitals near our home. And it was in those hospitals that we basically were reunited with families and began our rehabilitation. Most of us were in pretty good shape, don't forget. The ones that people that were seriously injured in captivity or leading up to captivity, they didn't make it. And so there were a couple of seriously injured that made it. I can name you John McCain. I can name you Colonel Fred Cherry. Had serious, but they got hospital care, and then they were able to come home. But most of us had wounds that we could recover from, and so we walked out of there, generally speaking, in pretty good shape. Our rehabilitation back home was not lengthy. We came home and we used the hospital, of course, for checkups and follow-up thing like dental care and operations to reset broken bones or things of that nature. But mostly we used it as a visiting quarters, VIP quarters, to go in and out until they were discharged and could go home. And of course, it was in those facilities that we were reunited with our families, those that had children and spouses, and so it was very good. It was a very planned operation. Operation Homecoming, what it was called, was well planned by the military, and I think everybody got very good care.
Great. So today we have a much greater understanding of the post-traumatic stress disorder and how you overcame this to continue to serve in the Navy until 1980, and then serve in the Reagan administration for 8 years as Deputy Director of the Peace Corps, later the Deputy Administrator of the Veterans Administration, now known as the Department of Veterans Affairs, and as a Vice President for Government Services with the Hospital Corporation of America. After government service, you went on to found a consulting firm, Alvarez LLC. What helped you guide your life after Vietnam when so many other veterans suffered with PTSD, depression, anger, and substance abuse?
You're right, Catherine. I did not, most of us did not walk out of there with anger. We were just found ourselves in a situation that we just had to deal with realistically. And in hindsight, when I was with the Veterans Administration and later on in my career, we did a lot of work with the Vietnam era veterans. This was in 1981, 82. Post-traumatic stress had been recognized, or it was being recognized by that time. And I recall we set up a lot of these counseling centers around the country, opened up these storefront operations. So we called them storefront operations, where the Vietnam veteran could walk in and get help. And it turned out to be very successful. And one of the biggest programs that was, as I recall, initiated were these sessions where they would sit around, they sit there under, counselor guidance, a group therapy where Vietnam veterans would sit around, talk about their experiences to each other. And as I recall, these were very, very helpful to the people that participated in this, which caused me to remember, because I asked the same question: why is it that our group, POWs, had come home and basically as a group had done very well with regard to not having post-traumatic stress? And on my first visit back to Vietnam, I went back with a filmmaker that wanted to do a documentary before they tore down the famous prison, the Hanoi Hilton, we called it. And I was sitting there and taking a break, and I was looking at the old section where the old cells were, and it struck me that, communicating and tapping to the fellow in the next cell. Every time we were called out to interrogation, every time we were taken out forced to do something or threatened by the Vietnamese or whatever, we would come back and immediately get on the wall and tap it throughout, and it was relayed throughout the system. So we kept everybody. Everything, every time we did something, and there were times when we were forced to do things that we were ashamed of, but that we had caved in and given them these things, and we try to, fill it with lies and what have you. But we caved in and we gave in and we felt guilty. We tapped that out to everybody, and that's how we were supported. We supported each other because we all went through the same experience. And I believe that in doing that, we were actually having our own sessions at the time where we were just pouring out any guilt, any feelings that we had, and if we did something that was good and that worked, we felt good about that. We would share that. We shared everything. We didn't hold back, and I think that really helped us as a group to, as I told people later, we walked out of there and we left all those ghosts behind. And these were the kind of ghosts that were bothering the Vietnam veterans, especially the ones that came back. They were 19, 20, 21-year-old kids. They were not welcomed with open arms. It was hard. It was hard for them. And so I think that was the big difference in my view.
So in the tap code communications, did you know more during your time of imprisonment of what was going on outside of the Hanoi Hilton and what was happening during the war, aside from the bombing that you described hearing going on around you? Did you know what was going on in the rest of the country and how the U.S. was faring?
We were able to filter, you might say, filter the propaganda. They had loudspeakers, and they would blast the loudspeaker, the Vietnam news, and they had a broadcaster that broadcast these in English. We called her Hanoi Hannah. These were broadcasts to the troops in South Vietnam. They also, fed it into us. and we had to sit there and listen to this mostly propaganda and progress and criticism of the United States and what have you through. So, but we were able to filter and pick out some things. For example, we pretty well figured that there were a lot of, actions and big battles when they kept repeating the number of American casualties and what big failures there were and what have you. We were able to pick up where they were. For example, they were saying that a big and powerful country like the United States, a country that can put a man on the moon, cannot feed its people and the poor, the Black, the ethnic minorities, and not have enough food to eat, not enough clothes to wear, and so forth. And did you hear that? We put a man on the moon. So that was basically that kind of ability to do that kept us there. And of course, the new guys that were shot down would bring in news and what have you. We missed a period from 1968 to 72 when there was the bombing had basically stopped in the north. And then when it picked up again, a lot of guys came in and really filled us up and brought us back up to speed. But that's how we knew what was going on in the world. And
So when
we didn't get any mail from home for a long time.
So the mail was something that should have been protected with the Geneva Convention, and in many other wars, POWs were able to receive care packages from the Red Cross, were required to have certain levels of food and clothing and shelter, and not be tortured. Why do you think the Vietnamese broke all of the Geneva Convention even after it was obvious full war conditions were happening?
Well, they always said that we're not POWs because there had been no declaration of war. We were treated as criminals, and along with that, we didn't get until the end, towards the end, close to release, when they started giving us a lot of packages from home that our families had sent, and through the Red Cross and mail and things of this nature. I mean, it was they claimed they never signed these agreements, and so it's just the way it was. It was a situation we had to deal with.
So you've said in other interviews that the anti-war protests in the U.S. During the Vietnam War fueled the Vietnamese spirit to continue fighting, continuously prolonging the war, endure incarceration. Some of the people believe that the anti-war protests pressured President Nixon to negotiate to end the war. 50 years later now, what are your thoughts about anti-war protests and your point of view? Would there have been anything to end the war sooner to bring you home?
Had we stopped the war, singularly stopped the war on our own behalf without having met certain conditions, I don't think a lot of us would have come home. They would not have let us come. So our release was a very important part. But to your question, now I still see that, I still feel that there's a strong difference in opinion that still exists amongst those who lived during those times, and those who demonstrated, and those who held anti-war and participated in the anti-war activities. They feel that they did the right thing, and it led to the halt of the war. And there were others who feel differently. And by the way, that difference exists among the POWs itself, but they most of us agree that it was President. When I say most of us, the POWs agree that it was President Nixon who brought us home. But he brought us home under the conditions that I think that, as a rule, the American public would accept. And that was, in his term, peace with honor, because we just couldn't, having invested so much into it, we had to get out of there, withdraw, and meet certain conditions. It took a long time. And so that's, no, I still feel that division still exists amongst those who are of our generation.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't, I don't know where I would have sat had I not been a POW, whether I would have sat in one camp or the other. I'll just throw that in.
Interesting. So over the past 50 years, as your understanding of Vietnam has changed, what do you wish those watching today would learn from your experience in the war?
I think that there were a couple of big things that we learned as a country, whether or not we stick to it. But number one is that if we're going to get involved in a war, we're going to get involved to win it. We didn't have that as an objective in Vietnam. It seemed like it was, they were just, I can't tell you what the objective was. I was, we got into it, being part of the Cold War, and it had been a French, Vietnam had been a French colony, and yeah, they wanted their independence, and so they turned to communist Chinese and Russian type of communism, because I guess they felt that was the only route to go, that they could actually get their independence, and it became a communist country. And our effort was to stop the spread. Now, people may not, some people, especially younger generations, may say, well, what's wrong with it? Socialism. But it's not the socialism, it's the totalitarianism aspect of communism that, and anybody who has lived in that kind of an environment, and I mean, they're fleeing their countries to come here. Yeah, I mean, during the Cold War, the Iron Curtain was keeping them in. Today, we're trying to figure out how to limit them. There's so many people want to come to the United States. So that's number one, is we're going to win. We're going to go in and fight. Let's win the war. And, Afghanistan, it was a situation which was developing into Vietnam to a point. Number two, and I think, in my view, this is big. When the guys came home from Vietnam, they were not welcomed with open arms. And we were, which I attribute that to the point that the country was tired and wanted, and we're in a better mood when this thing was ended, and they looked upon us as heroes, and that was not fair to the other guys who went and fought. The other guys that put their lives on hold and served and did their job, and then came back, and we're not welcome because the public put the divisiveness fell on the troops and not the policymakers. And so that was wrong. I think that the country has learned that no matter how you feel about the policies, whether if we're going to a war or not, these young men and women who serve in our military go where our government sends them. And so I think we could all agree that we need to support them. We need to support our people who serve put the blame, if you don't agree with it, on our policymakers, our leaders.
So we did have one follow-up question, which was about, when did you hear about the landing on the moon, the astronauts, and was that a year later, or was that fairly quickly that showed up in the propaganda radio messaging?
No, I think it was fairly quickly, because quick to point out, talking about, how bad the American people are being treated and given as rich and powerful and just, able to put a man on the moon, and we can't clothe and feed and educate our own people. And, it was a typical Hanoi Hannah propaganda broadcast.
And then can you tell us about why did you decide to stay in the military after being imprisoned for so long?
Well, I came home. I enjoyed the job in the military in terms of the flying, the camaraderie. I mean, it was back then to go into the flight training program. And by the way, before I was shot down, I had decided I was going to get in the application process of the astronaut program. I have a friend who we had joined the military same day actually, and he went through, did not get shot down, continued on. Bob Crippen became an astronaut, but we started out in the same path. I'm not saying I would have, but I was at the position I would have qualified with a minimum amount of single engine jet hours. I was in line to go to postgraduate school to get a master's in a science, and that would have been aeronautical engineering, which Bob did. I got shot down. And so, but I had, I felt I would have had to meet a lot of obstacles and hoops and requirements along the way. I'm not saying I could have made it, but I was in line to do that. And so, no, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the camaraderie. I had 14 years by the time I continued, and I had, and it was good training. When I was assigned to Washington, D.C., I started going to law school on my own at night at George Washington University. And other opportunities opened up after I left the military that so I don't regret it one bit. I mean, in fact, I enjoyed it. Had I not been shot, I enjoyed what I was doing as an aviator and as a naval officer.
Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us, Commander Alvarez. Thank you so much for your service, and good luck in your nomination for the Congressional Gold Medal. On behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library and our guest speaker, I'd like to thank you for participating in today's webinar. And the museum will be hosting a photographic and tactile exhibit on the Vietnam War called Tet and the Battle of Hue, opening to the public May 16th through September 30th. Registration and more information about other program opportunities, current and upcoming exhibits, and library resources are all available on our website, pritzkermilitary.org. This webinar was recorded and will be available to the public on PMML's Education YouTube playlist. A link to this recording will be emailed to each of the registered participants, and we hope you enjoyed today's program and subscribe to our YouTube channel and provide feedback. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.